Welcome everyone who's arriving. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this final webinar of the year, hosted by the BSA Study Group on Post-Colonial and Decolonial Transformations. I'm Meghan Tinsley. I'm Presidential Fellow in Ethnicity and Inequalities at the University of Manchester, and I'm one of the 4 co-conveners of the study group, alongside Saskia Papadakis, who's co-chairing this event, Gurminder Bhamra, and Ali Meghji. The topic of today's webinar is Decolonizing Climate Discourse. It begins with the acknowledgement that the global climate crisis poses one of the most pressing and most existential challenges of the 21st century. But the way we talk about the crisis, and by extension, the way we respond, reflects divergent and power-laden understandings of its fundamental nature and scope. And so this afternoon, we're pleased to welcome 2 speakers who will delve into the imperial origins and racialized expressions of the climate crisis and consider the potential for decolonial responses. So I'll introduce both of them now, and then they'll speak back to back. So our first speaker, Professor Nosheen Ali, is Global Faculty in Residence at New York University. A sociologist by training, she's also an author and activist who works and writes across a wide range of themes, including feminist theories of the state, seed justice, and Muslim cultural politics. Her most recent book, Delusional States, Feeling Rule and Development in Pakistan's Northern Frontier, was published by Cambridge last year, and it provides the first in-depth study of state power, citizenship, and social struggle in Gilgit-Baltistan, a contested territory that forms part of the disputed borderland of Kashmir. Also last year, she published Decolonizing Nature and Knowledge, Indigenous Environmental Thought and Feminist Praxis, in collaboration with her students at Aga Khan University. Particularly relevant for today's topic, in 2016, Nosheen founded Karti Dharti, an alternative rural institute for ecological inquiry and ecodiversity outside of Karachi. Karti Dharti is an emergent space that strives to document and preserve the indigenous seed heritage of Sindh, implement sustainable soil practices through regenerative agriculture, and embody an ecological sanctuary where the bees and butterflies can feel happy. Our second speaker, Professor Arun Saldanha, is Professor of Geography at the University of Minnesota. His research centers on theoretical questions of race, which has led him to consider vastly different fields, from his first book on whiteness and rave tourism in Goa to his subsequent project on Dutch exploration of the Indian Ocean at the beginning of the colonial and capitalist era, to his recent article in Society and Space, entitled A Date with Destiny, Racial Capitalism and the Beginnings of the Anthropocene. Arun engages more broadly with environmental justice, climate change, and the philosophy of biology, Marxism, and political theory, underpinned by continental philosophy. So the 2 speakers approach climate discourse from the perspective of 2 different disciplines, but it's striking to see the common threads in their research interests: race, nation, power, globalization, capitalism. I'm curious about how these themes inform their respective work on nature and climate, and I look forward to the discussion that will emerge from their presentations. Each of them will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and the remainder of the time will be devoted to questions. So with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Professor Nosheen Ali.
Thank you, Meghan. Thank you, Saskia, and thank you to the Post/Decolonial Working Group for putting this panel together. Very excited to have this occasion at the end of 10 months of this pandemic. I got COVID, my mother got COVID, my sister got COVID. Post-viral symptoms and fatigue is real. It impacts your mental and physical strength. And there was a moment in New York, I'm speaking right now from New York, when in one day, so much climate was changing outside. You know, it was snowing in May and it was very sunny 2 hours later. And I really felt the climate change in my body, where you are going from extreme sweats to extreme cold, your breath is out of whack, you have severe chest pains. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge our bodily experience of what the earth has been going through for a while. And I have not been able to even begin to articulate the trauma of COVID, but it just signals to you the trauma of life on earth, and how our bodies are catching up and being shaken up by it in some ways during this pandemic. Um, I also want to share, because so much of decolonial discourse, so much of discourse on um, the colonial mode of being has centered our imaginaries of what anti-racist thought would look like, what anti-imperial thought would look like. And my work on Gilgit-Baltistan looks at some of these topics. Um, but today, although Meghan introduced my work on Karti Dharti, but I want to start with talking about linguistic imperialism. Um, Several scholars in indigenous studies, Latin American studies as well, have talked about the monopoly of Western epistemology. And it's not just Western epistemology, I'm beginning to realize it's Western epistemic life, which is beyond thoughts and frameworks. So, this is a whole system of slaughter and genocide that lives on in the development visions and aspirations of where I come from. And we will get to these development visions, rather developer visions, real estate developer visions, in a bit as well. But the question of linguistic imperialism and linguistic homogeneity gets erased in our conversation sometimes. I have been to conferences where French speakers speak in French, Spanish speakers speak in Spanish. Um, and it's strange, I'm from Pakistan, and Urdu and Punjabi are majority languages, dominant languages, in fact. And in Manchester, in the UK, I'm told that the second most spoken language is Urdu and Punjabi. And these are languages that are very dear to me, that are home languages. Um, we do not have permission, you know. So we can talk about multiculturalism, but I do not see academia as outside our decolonial impetus towards nature and towards climate disasters. In fact, I see academia as central to maintaining the structures of oppression of capitalist modernity. So the concern with creating newer spaces uh, in which we can recognize that languages are not just languages, but they are worlds with ecological consciousness. That's the first point I wanted to make. Maybe the second point. I will lose track of my numbers. Because my sense is, I've worked a lot on seeds. I've written on seed politics in Pakistan and farmer sovereignty, food sovereignty in Pakistan. But this dissecting of problems is one of the problems of Western epistemology, right? So our seeds and languages have been looted from us. And to me, the diversity of species, the diversity of seeds, the diversity of languages, and the diversity of ethnicities are interconnected aspects of society and survival. This is a major concern in Pakistan today because a kind of monoculturalism is being driven inside us due to Pakistani nationalism. And then there is a kind of monocultural discourse that is driven inside us because of academic imperialism and because of global cultural imperialism. So, my work over the last decade has been on researching landscapes of love, resistance, and ecology, especially in Muslim poetics and with a focus on Muslim societies, specifically Sindh, Gilgit Baltistan, and Kashmir and Punjab. And I will not have time to go over um, a lot of that work, but I wanted permission to switch languages with translation. Given that this is being hosted by the British Sociological Association, I think it's high time to decolonize instead of writing an article about it, that I actually speak my language when it feels natural. This is also about decolonizing ourselves, recovering the loss of self, which is the same as the loss of nature. Um, I don't know how I will do this translation. This is when you can't do code switching that well. Anyway, if the language comes, I will go with the flow. Um, I want to start with talking about Kashmir and Punjab and then go towards Gilgit-Baltistan. The scholar Dr. Mona Bhan has done incredible research on occupied Kashmir, on Indian occupied Kashmir. And in one of her talks, she makes the argument of seeing militarization as a climate catastrophe. Many of us Kashmir scholars have looked at the occupation, have looked at surveillance, have looked at the Kashmiri right to self-determination, and we've looked at ecology. My work has looked at ecology as well, so has hers. But the over the last decade, the sheer pace at which land grabbing, at which mega development projects on both sides are causing an ecological meltdown in these ecologically sensitive zones deserves notice. And it is because of toxic nationalisms of Pakistan and India. It is because of new annihilatory legal and development regimes. So Professor Bhan talks about the new dam building projects, as well as the annexation of Kashmir last year through the revocation of Article 370. And I want to bring to light in Gilgit-Baltistan, you have the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese government, and how that has contributed to just megalomaniacal development dreams, completely out of touch with the realities of people, with the realities of the geographies that they are being literally bulldozed upon. And more recently in Sindh, where I'm from, we see that the central government tried to pass two laws which just illegally annexed two islands of Sindh and said, we're going to just sell them off to CPEC, and this is now going to be a developer's paradise. So when we talk about decolonizing climate discourse, we have to talk about decolonizing development discourse, which is one of the primary causes in the lands that I've studied and I'm from, which is causing annihilation as we speak. So I was just watching on Twitter, 800,000 farmers' livelihoods stand to be threatened by the, not acquisition, by just these illegal legal regimes, if you like, which are all sold to us in the name of development. So occupation is a lens that Kashmiri scholars have long argued for. They have talked about theorizing India as a settler colonial state. And what I'd like to suggest after moving from Kashmir towards Punjab now, is first how militarism is a threat to climate because of the military bootprint. Second, occupation is not just the physical presence of militaries and militarism. Even our food system is occupied. When you work on Kashmir and when you start following the farmers' revolts in Punjab at present, in Indian Punjab, you start thinking, oh, how they're challenging occupation, right? It's amazing how our research lenses keep traveling to different field sites. So what do I mean by the food and ecological systems of the world being occupied? They're occupied by corporate monopolies. They're occupied by corporate monopolies here and in Pakistan. What is happening in India is quite phenomenal right now. We have more than 500,000 farmers who are at the borders of Delhi protesting these laws and in effect showing us the path towards what I would call a decorporatization of society. They are saying you are slaves to the corporates. We have no doubt about that. We will not be enslaved by them. And they are being told that they are stupid. They are being told that they are terrorists. They are being marginalized right, left, and center by Indian media. So I want to suggest here that when we say nature, sometimes we think, trees or weather patterns. But so much of what the farmers' revolutions are doing today in India are about decolonizing and are about decorporatizing and taking back state policy, taking back the right of federal governments to reflect corporations and profits over people. So, red salute and lal salam to our comrades on the ground right now. It is not possible for me to talk about decolonizing nature without recognizing what is happening in Kashmir and Punjab and Sindh. Some places are just emotionally inside you always. Now I will shift to Gilgit Baltistan and let me share my screen. Okay, so the question of decolonizing nature begs the question of what is nature and what is colonizing. And I've shed some light on expanding our understandings of colonizing, occupation, and nature in my previous comments. I'll now go towards some of my fieldwork in Gilgit Baltistan, which is part of disputed Kashmir. And that's where I did the fieldwork for my book, Delusional States. So here the problem with language comes up. No matter how hard I try, half my work in academia is translating Urdu and Punjabi and Sindhi words into English, and it always feels inadequate because languages are the epistemologies. They're not just words. Each word is a world within itself. तो नेचर का लफ्ज उर्दू में नहीं है, कुदरत काफ़ी आम है साउथ एशिया में, इंडिया में, पाकिस्तान में. द वर्ड दैट इज़ वेरी कॉमन इज़ कुदरत. And Kudrat means God's miracle, blessing, and creation, according to one of my interviewees. So immediately, if I were to switch to Urdu right now and use words such as dharti, so I'm the founder of Karti Dharti, once I start talking about Karti Dharti, English kind of escapes me at some level. Because the moment I say dharti, the dharti has the dharkan, which is my heartbeat. The dharti has land. Dharti has a spiritual dimension. Dharti is where I will return to when I will die. There's a huge spirito-poetic framework that comes in just that word, dharti. Kudrat is a similar word. And to give you a personal example, when I was growing up, my mother, I would be awake at 5 a.m. and my mother would be like, "Are you watching these birds?" And I'm like, "Yes." They're chirping. I'm like, "Yes." Why they're chirping? I'm like, "Why are they chirping?" Because they are praying to God. And that is why we get up in the morning and pray to God. There's a fundamentally sacred worldview, which is in the language, in an understanding of birds. I can't now go and hear bird sounds without thinking of prayers, because that's been part of my, which I didn't realize at the time, but silently ecological upbringing. This awe and inspiration that is related to God's blessings or rahmat is linked to a sense of gratitude. So Muslim indigenous life worlds have a lot to offer in expanding our conversation on indigenous environmental consciousness. So as one of my interviews said, Kudrat is God's rahmat. Therefore, people's relationship with nature is one of respect and thankfulness. We celebrate many festivals thanking God and nature. One has to work hard in order to benefit from God's blessings. To get from nature, you have to give to it and be respectful and thankful. So there is no need for conservation in Kudrat because it is an inbuilt mechanism of conservation. I later on in the book go on to conservation as a neoliberal project in Gilgit-Baltistan, how national parks and community-based hunting areas are being resisted. But the gist of it is how people's sense of labor and nature are intrinsically connected, and how the witnessing and seeing and caring is very different than the rhetoric of saving nature that a lot of conservation organizations promote, that we must save nature and we must save wildlife. So this kind of concept tells us why language is so integral to understanding ecological epistemologies, if you like. Meghan, how am I doing on time?
You have 6 minutes.
Excellent. Um, I will skip this. I will talk about a paper that some of my students, graduate students in Pakistan, and I co-authored. It's called Decolonizing Nature / Knowledge, and that's the hint of why I see decolonizing nature as a way to decolonize knowledge and vice versa. And I think some of my co-authors are present here. I saw Barkat Ali there, and I think that is my co-author Barkat Ali. Um, some of the people from Gilgit-Baltistan cannot join because of bad internet. So I'm sad about that. This is a story in the paper shared by Najmi Khatun. And I don't know how to make people disappear so I can, yeah. My homeland is Gilgit-Baltistan, the heaven on the mountains. It is incredible to see how the people lived and survived in rough and barren mountains for centuries. It is not that they lived a very easy breezy life, but there is no such report which reflected that people starved to death due to drought. People had a habit of living a very sustainable life. One day, a 10-centimeter long poisonous centipede entered our living room. My siblings and I panicked to see the creeping creature. My mother rushed to bring a bowl of flour from the box and hand it over to my grandmother. They never thought for a second to kill it. In fact, it was treated like a guest from nature. For its respect, a very traditional exercise was performed. My grandmother took a pinch of the flour and sprinkled on the back of the centipede so it could leave the house with dignity and respect. Sprinkling flour is not just any normal activity. It is always performed on special occasions and ceremonies when a new baby is born, when a groom and bride first enter the home, when a very special guest is invited, when an elder is back home from a special journey of life, like hunting, voyage, or expedition. To our surprise, that centipede left the place and we never saw it again. Today, there is a greater need of such lesson to revise because poisonous and harmful chemicals replaced the pinch of flour of grandma. There are more such narratives in our collectively co-authored piece. And what the authored piece centers is this spiritual intimacy, is a sense of hospitality, is a sense in some stories, it's not clear from this one, but in others it is, how animals and humans are co-constituted rather than coexisting. And that I think is very significant to attend to in the current conjuncture. So this idea of ecology as culture, as spiritual matter, as matter, and matter as spiritual is something that comes with religious and oral traditions in many parts of Muslim countries. And what I want to say here is that this veneration is routinely denied legitimacy in mainstream academia, in notions of science, in social science, and environmental education. So I think the point that I started with, which is linguistic imperialism and about decolonizing academia, is linked to what a struggle it was for my students who grew up in Gilgit-Baltistan to articulate something so intimate and intrinsic to their beings in an alien language. The colonizer is within us. It's not some external racialized imperial logic. We are living it in Pakistan, in our education systems. So yeah, I think the spiritual intimacy of nature is what we discuss in that article, and I want to invite all of us to think about that, and I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Nosheen. That was beautiful. I'm looking forward to this discussion already. So now I'd like to turn it over to Professor Arun Saldanha for his presentation, The Intrinsic Racialization of Societal Collapse, Climate Change and Pandemics as Colonial Phenomena. So over to you, Arun. Oh, you're muted. Okay, there you go.
This is better. Thanks, Meghan. Thanks, everyone, for organizing this, the BSA. Thanks, Nosheen, Ali, for an amazing first talk in this webinar. I'm also going to preface my talk with the place that I'm speaking from. George Floyd was murdered just 6 blocks from my house here in Minneapolis, and there was a huge reckoning in thinking about this nation state as built on slavery, as built on genocide, which amazingly spread to many other countries. And so I was very proud of that. That's been a real shift in frameworks. It's been in many ways unprecedented that racial capitalism has been interrogated to such an extent by young people in media like Teen Vogue. I was quite surprised that Teen Vogue is so critical of racism and of patriarchy. And so it's a good moment for thinking about race. Of course, I would want to push a lot further. I would also want to think about how a murder like George Floyd's fits into ecologies of racism and colonialism, which much predate police brutality. And I think Nosheen has really sketched a lot of some of the theoretical points that I would like to make about race and the racial system as it pervades capitalism, as built on colonization, and which is from the beginning this assemblage which at once subjugates some populations in order to gain profit for a small minority of people in Europe, but also destroys ecosystems and livelihoods and cosmologies and entire worlds, you could say, in order for that whole system to expand more and more. And so my theoretical sources are very much in critical race theory, but I've been becoming more and more a Marxist, but a different kind of Marxist. And so I call myself not a grumpy Marxist. There's a lot of grumpy Marxists in geography, which I respect very much. But their work on race and gender and environmental issues has always been subservient to just always returning to Marx. And so one of the things that I do in the paper that Meghan mentioned, I'm still not completely happy with the paper, but it's a snapshot of my sort of very long-term work in building a kind of Marxism, heterodox Marxism, or Marxist critical race theory, or structuralist Marxism. There's lots of names for it, in order to talk about the global racial system as something that is material, that is embodied, that is effective, that is an assemblage, and that thereby involves non-human processes, ecological processes, and hence we can talk about something like climate change or the pandemic as racialized phenomena. So I've got to apologize right away about my title, because what I wanted to do is focus on climate change and epidemic and as colonial phenomena. And I have to say that's something that, they're definitely racialized phenomena. And so I'll talk a little bit about the colonial situation. But bear with me, because how, for example, something like police brutality in the US, police brutality in India or Pakistan, caste divisions, various forms of interethnic violence in many parts of the world, how that is within one nation state a colonial situation. That is something that I have not worked out enough for today. So although of course it's clear that climate change on a global level has patterns which reproduce those of European imperialism and colonialism, and although of course it's clear that there are colonialist aspects to the way that governments respond to the pandemic, whether I want to call them colonial as such is something that I've not concluded yet. So apologies for that, but basically I'll talk about climate change and pandemics as racialized phenomena. So just a few ways into the discussion here. I do very theoretical work. I don't have a concrete case study like Nosheen has, fortunately or unfortunately. So it's very theoretical work, and the last few years I have been writing mostly theory. And so what I'll tell you today is just where I'm coming from. I'll cite a lot of books, or I'll have front covers of the books so that at least everyone will see something that they've read. I'll talk a little bit about this interest in the colonial situation, and I'll end talking about a few examples of disasters. And so where I'm coming from is a theoretical question that I come very much from British culture studies. So very much in cultural geography in the 90s, what we were doing was thinking about race as a social construction, as a discourse, as a representation. How is race known? How do people have racist ideas? How is a particular part of the city represented in the media? How, for example, is there a discourse today about climate refugees? These are racialized discourses, these are racialized representations. But I was trying to push that a little bit more and think about the reality of people racializing themselves, being racialized, living these realities that are depicted in representations. And so I think intuitively it's quite easy to grasp what I've been trying to do. It is really about talking about race as a material reality. And so this is part of a larger movement in the humanities to move away from representationalism, away from the linguistic turn, away from thinking about texts and signs and semiotics and signification, to talking about the material things and the landscapes and the actual processes, like are studied in sort of realist social science and most of the social sciences. So what is race? What kind of system is race? How do we divide people, not just in discourse, but in reality? And then I will just mention here another movement turning towards an ontology of race, associated with Sylvia Winter, Frank Wilderson, and a number of other people in Black studies, which are also talking about an ontology of race. They come at it from a different theoretical point of view. They come from it from Heidegger, basically a Heideggerian tradition, more or less. But they do have this in common with what I'm doing is talking about humanity as, of course, internally split by a stratification that we call race, by racism, but also race is actually something more than human. And Nosheen was talking about this, the way that colonialism, for example, happens, or the way that you have segregation in American cities, especially in the West, is that it's not just sort of social relations, but that it requires buildings, it requires roads, it requires factories, it requires highways, it requires all of these non-human aspects of reality that we usually don't talk about in the social sciences, or we sort of know that they're there, but we don't talk about. And so a lot of you in sociology will associate that with Bruno Latour. So talking about materiality, talking about humans as embedded in these ecosystems of processes, of flows, of interactions. There's a whole bunch of perspectives here. I'm mainly coming from Elizabeth Gross and corporeal feminism here. And so, materialist feminism is very much, and especially the philosophical bedrock here is Deleuze, Deleuze and Guattari. But yeah, so there's also in this work a much more friendly relationship to science than physical sciences than we have in the humanities. And then what happened in more recent years is that a lot of these authors actually started talking about climate change, about earth processes, about Anthropocene, ecological processes, environmental humanities. There's actually a journal that started fairly recently in 2014, the Geohumanities. And so this work is thinking about the earth, is thinking about the Anthropocene. Donna Haraway's book, of course, is well known. Catherine Yusuf is a dear friend. Except for Catherine, none of these books talks about race. And so what I would like to do is actually see if geohumanities can have something to say about, can have something to contribute to critical race theory. And so the article that Meghan mentioned is part of that effort to think about the Anthropocene as racialized, to think about environmental justice, carbon inequalities, differential mobility, rising sea levels, distributions of toxins as themselves racialized phenomena. And so, the monoculture that Nosheen mentioned, the inequalities of food, the disparities of health, all of those things that are studied, mostly outside of the humanities, are part of these physical realities that I say are our race. It's not that race is of course it's represented. You can find race in movies and poetry, in academic discourse and administration. But I want to talk about those realities, just like Latour talks about the reality of scientific practice. So just to have a sloganist approach to it, so if race is a social construction, it is historically assembled or constructed from capital, landscapes, things, and bodies before it is represented. And so this is a realist epistemology. This is saying, yes, there were actually tigers which were shot in the British Raj. I'm guessing also, also in Thailand and elsewhere, and in Africa, the hunting was part of the whole masculine nature of colonialism. And so what you have here is this racial difference, also class difference, also gender difference, also imperial chauvinism, constructed not just in the discourses about these practices, but in the practices themselves. So you could say, going back to the geohumanities a bit, that racialization proceeds through the earth, through ecosystems, through deforestation, through setting up food regimes and constructing cities. One of the interests that I have in this figure, Georges Ballandier, is he's an anthropologist, mainly a French anthropologist, and he has an interesting article of 1951, this colonial situation. It's translated the next year. And I was just interested in him because he talks about, he has this idea of the colonial situation. And I was intrigued with it because Frantz Fanon talks about it throughout. And so I was just wondering where that came from. And again, I have to admit, because of the fatigue that Nosheen mentioned, that I've not actually come to seeing where this term situation comes from, but I was just intrigued that a lot of the people in the 1950s and 60s were using this term, the colonial situation. This situation was overlooked in sociology and anthropology in the West. And why? Because, well, sociology was mainly interested in seeing what modern life is about. So there was this sort of self-congratulation of European sociologists. We've come so far. We are no longer primitive. We are not backward. We're the sort of the vanguard of the rest of the world. And in anthropology, there was a sense, well, we're studying pure cultures unaffected by modernity. And so, of course, there's many exceptions. I don't know much about the history of sociology and anthropology, but I believe Ballandier when he says that we've actually not tried to theorize what, a posteriori. So just a theoretical approach, like what is colonialism? So it's just amazing to me that had to, you had to wait till 1951 that someone actually says, hey, the social sciences have not looked at this. Like what is colonialism? How does it affect social roles? How should the social sciences look for this? So, I'm not going to go over these. There's all sorts of things that are obviously there. He points to Marxism and Lenin. Lenin was the first major sort of theorist about imperialism. It's all mostly created for the profits of the colonizers. There's a few rich people and nouveau riche in a place like the British Raj, which also benefit, but by and large, almost all of the profits go to Britain. Going back to what I was saying about looking at colonialism and racialization as something that requires changes to ecosystems. You have, of course, the raw materials pillaged, you have deforestation, all sorts of things that all of you can imagine. And so a lot of some of the theoretical points in Fanon can be found here, but he makes way more sophisticated interventions, I think, of thinking about racialization. Black skin, white masks the next year after this article, and then Wretched of the Earth 9 years later. But it's interesting to see this one particular figure. It's just like a sort of a shout out, I guess, to this forgotten white anthropologist. One thing that I find interesting is that the fact that the colonial situation is theorized by this anthropologist, French anthropologist working on Africa, is precisely when colonialism is going to end. It's very clear. There's a lot of anti-colonial movements, violent anti-colonial movements in Madagascar specifically, and then of course the French were ousted after a bloody civil war in Algeria and other North African places. And so it's interesting that what he notes is that there's a pervasive sense of crisis. And so this brings me back to thinking about catastrophe, disaster, the end of the world as being a very important aspect, maybe the most important aspect for thinking about race and for thinking about colonialism. Whether it was the colonists, especially the poor colonists who were white colonists who were in the French Empire, who were the most racist and the most brutal towards the natives. They were clinging on to empire. They knew that it was ending. And of course, for the native population itself, it was from the beginning catastrophic, being exploited, being displaced. In the case of the Americas, almost annihilated. So another part of the picture to sort of to bring up, and this brings me to Manchester. I teach a course on the history of Europe, and we read Engels's 1844 classic. And of course, Engels does not mention race. The Marxist tradition has not talked about race very much. And there's all sorts of apologies. There's also, eco-socialists say that that Marx was an environmentalist. I think that's bullshit. Marx was very much involved with thinking about industrialization as mostly a good thing. There are some moments where he thinks about race. There's some moments when he thinks about maybe gender. I don't know. That's not been enough analyzed. He mentioned slavery a few times, but on the whole, the Marxist tradition did not look enough about how industrialization in Northern England, especially in Lancashire first, required the capital which was amassed from centuries of slavery and genocide, especially across the Atlantic, but also in Asia. And so this has been a debate within Marxism. There's a few Marxists which disagree. But one thing that is amazing about 2020 is that this argument has actually come into the public sphere. And so what happened was, from one police murder in my neighborhood, 6 blocks from me, suddenly, I'm from Belgium, I'm half Indian, half Belgian. Suddenly in Belgium, people were talking about how slavery helped Belgian industrialization, quasi-slavery. King Leopold was supposed to save Africa from slavery, but that was it was totally indistinguishable from slavery, and even more brutal in many ways. So, and of course in this country. So thinking about the wealth of America as built on slavery, but also genocide, and of course take a lot. So I have a lot of balls in the air that I'm juggling, I know, but the coal pollution is definitely something that Engels mentions, and so you can see that ecological dimension there. And of course, that's the beginning of climate change. The fact that what happened in Lancashire was not just a hugely exploitative of working class people, but it set in motion a system which would cause the world's climate to change. This is really important to sort of think about, and Andreas Malm's book, a lot of you will know, is a very good this is the instant classic on this question, although again he doesn't mention race nor gender. So I'll end here. Let me check the time. Yes, that's good. With a few more points, I think, and then we can see what questions there are. So when it comes to thinking about the catastrophe, thinking about what's going to happen this century, my interest is to take seriously this notion of the end of the world, or the end of worlds. And it's a religious concept. For centuries, the people who've been thinking about this has not been philosophers, secular philosophers. The religious name for that is apocalypse, and the area of theology dealing with this is eschatology. And so I've been reading some in this literature and seeing whether you can have a secular eschatology. I appreciate what Nosheen was also talking about having academic discourse be open to having conversations with religious and spiritual traditions. And so it's clear that worlds have already ended. When you think about Native America, when you think about the kinds of cultural formation that Black America is, when you think about so many other small and large genocides that have happened across the world because of capitalism, because of colonialism, when you think about the rising sea levels, all of these point to the fact that that people have been experiencing apocalypse for 4 or 5 centuries, going back to when the Spanish and Portuguese started colonizing the East Atlantic islands, the Guanche of the Canary Islands. I talk about that group or that tribe or that people as being the first to have been exterminated by European colonialism in the 15th century. So this is not to say that other cultures have not had empires, have not had sort of various forms of violence, systematic violence against populations. But the difference with Europe is that it spanned the globe and that it put itself in the middle of this whole system, saying we are the pinnacle of the human species and we will lead the whole, we have the right and even the duty to lead the whole human species into this new space of modernity. And so the Chinese, nor the Arabs, nor any other kinds of empires ever did that. They didn't want to, they didn't have the technology, whatever. Anyway, so that's a long story to talk about the Anthropocene, or the situation that the Earth finds itself now as being disaster prone in ways that have been happening for a long time. And so obviously, when we talk about natural disaster, hurricanes, etc., as a social scientist and humanities scholar, we can all agree it's never natural. It always expresses and tends to reinforce social disparities. I say tends to because you do have spontaneous solidarity that happens in every disaster. I think that's really important to talk about for ethical and for political reasons. Yeah, and then when we're talking about the rest of the century, I'm interested in these future imaginations, and I don't write about dystopian literature or dystopian movies, but they can be helpful to think about. These are always going to be racialized. A very quick example that I do. I was going to talk about at the AAG this year is space exploration. The fact that all of these capitalists are thinking about going into outer space. These are subtly racialized for being, the Earth is going to hell, and so let us have these new space colonies outside. And of course, this is reproducing the white colonial imagination. There's a lot of literature on that. A few quick examples. I've mentioned the United States. And so when this mountain is mountains of horns of buffalo, so an unimaginable amount of buffalo were just exterminated absurdly and brutally by colonizers on the Great Plains of North America in order to clear the land for for farming. But also, of course, in the process, keeping away the livelihoods of the Indians, the Great Plain Indians. And so this is, for me, a very, there's a great book called The Destruction of the Buffalo. And so there's these sorts of environmental histories which point to the fact that colonialism and institutional racism have to change environments physically in order for them to, to be established. And of course, the extermination of the buffalo goes hand in hand with the almost extermination of the tribes here where I live. New Orleans is an obvious example of biopolitics, of the fact that the state, in a racialized manner, allows some people to live and allows a lot of people to die. Detroit is a city that I've often visited. These sorts of places are unimaginable to Europeans. If you ever come to the US, please do go to Detroit if you can. The scale of abandonment is unimaginable. We've got segregation in Belgium, you've got it in Manchester, you've got it in London, but this is really something else. It's really, like destitution that I associate with India. It's really block after block after block. And so these are environmental, physical, material processes which kill a city. The Detroit was almost killed, so that you can talk about an end of a world that happened by the late 60s, of course, with the uprising, which is another matter. And then finally, climate change. So the article that Meghan mentioned talks about Anthropocene, talks about the anthropos in anthropogenic in Anthropocene. This is something everyone knows. The people who have caused climate change, or the populations, the states, and the regimes, are going to be mostly all right, while the people who have least contributed to climate change are going to have most of the effects. And these tend to be Black and brown people. So, of course, some white populations, like in Arizona, are going to feel the pinch of rising heat. But by and large, the rising sea levels, the droughts, the hurricanes, the locust swarms, the new disease regimes, all of these are going to be worse in what were formerly colonies. So, and then even further, I will take another step and say that the ways that the market solutions are always pushed in the Paris Agreement, in the European New Deal, you know, they play lip service to human rights, but insofar as they're based on capitalist solutions and techno fixes, they are not going to probably, you know, if we can go by history, they are not going to be the solution at all. They will be for profit and not for people. And this is again something that Nosheen also has said about the Pakistani case, but this is the case across the global south. This is one paper that I recommend. I will end with that. Claire Colebrook is another Deleuzian feminist, and it's interesting that she wrote this in a biology journal. I don't know very much about the journal, Bioethical Inquiry, but it was a special issue about the pandemic, and she puts a lot of these things together. She puts the revolutionary violence of the Black Lives Matter movement, which she reads through Fanon, together with the slow violence of corona, of climate change, which is racializing as well. And so she presents us with some hope that people waking up to catastrophe and to understanding just how rigged the whole system is at the level of the city of Minneapolis, Manchester, but also globally. Understanding the system in this very complex way, in these many different registers, can actually get us to fight it and to suggest another kind of system. And so this is the newfound Marxism that I've obtained. So I'll leave it at that. And thanks again for this invitation. Stop this sharing.
Thank you, Arun, and thank you, Nosheen. Both of those were very difficult presentations to listen to. I think it's often we use theory to avoid thinking about the reality of a situation at times, and it became clear in both presentations that theory doesn't insulate us from the reality of the crisis at hand. I'm struck by how many bodies of literature and how many experiences you both brought into the conversation too. It gives a bit of insight into the scale of the climate crisis and how it's as intimate as language and as the human body and as global as the final map that Arun showed. So we have 15 minutes now for questions and discussion. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box, and then I will read them aloud and address them to the presenters. We have one question already from Ihsan Arslan. Ihsan asks, my question is directed towards Dr. Nosheen. Have people articulated experiencing eco-grief, or the grief that comes with loss of bodies like mountains, glaciers, and lakes, etc., especially in Gilgit-Baltistan, keeping in mind the idea that all bodies are co-constituted? Is there a community aspect to this grief, and what form does this articulation take, if it exists?
Thank you, Ihsan, for this wonderful question. Folk narratives, or what are called folk culture, folk stories in Gilgit-Baltistan talk a lot about the hunt and the suffering of the younger ibex when his or her mother is being hunted down. So a sense of reality, a sense of mourning is, I would say, also inbuilt in the way wildlife and the pain of animals, the pain of animal suffering is given respect in Gilgit-Baltistani folk culture. So one of the arguments that I've made in my poetic work is that it's not a coincidence that Shimshal, which is where my research was based on conservation and ecology in Gilgit-Baltistan, is a biodiversity hotspot, that there are rare wildlife species, including the markhor and snow leopard, alive there. The spirito-poetic frameworks that engender the fact that the pastures are holy, the fairies there are holy, the animals you have to give shares to certain animals and to certain spirit beings, locally called Shavanan in some part of Gilgit-Baltistan, in which the article I referenced talks about, that these are enormous worldviews and visions which have a very deep sense of, I would not say grief, but reciprocity. And a lot of the narratives are about the sorrow caused to wildlife and to animals if you infringe on their rights. Notice the story. I mean, I just shared one story, I had a few more. That even when a centipede comes, the instinct is not to kill it. The instinct is that it's a guest of nature and it must be fed a pinch of flour. I think that alone, and that is not unique. From Hindu stories that I've collected in Sindh, you will see how flour is aate ke chota sa piece is fed to ants as the first thing that a woman does in a village or in the city of Karachi. And why do they do that? Well, I was told, if we don't care of these minutest beings, so-called minutest beings, who will care for them? So do you see what I'm saying? That it's not just grief, it is enormous care and love. And in my current work, I look at ecology in Muslim consciousness, in Muslim tradition. I'm looking at Rumi and his song of the reed or complaint of the reed, which is a sacred grief, which is a sacred cry. If you read the first few lines of this beloved Muslim philosopher, poet, saint, it starts with the flute lover mourning the fact that it's cut off from the reed bed. It's fundamentally ecological. And yeah, so that's what I will say, that it is inbuilt. It's inbuilt in history. It's inbuilt in consciousness. Nature is not separate from our thought.
Thank you for that. The next question, two questions, are from Gulam Beg, who says, I have two questions, one for each panelist. First, Dr. Nosheen, do you think that the social climate in Great Britain needs to be inclusive? I don't know if you've studied disabled people in Great Britain, and especially including women. And second, Dr. Arun, would disaster and biopolitics play a part in the subcontinent more if war breaks out with India and Pakistan? Arun, why don't you answer the question first, and then Nosheen.
Yeah, I appreciated what Nosheen was talking about. I mean, the question of war and the problem of war. The Pentagon has the largest carbon footprint of all institutions and actors in the US. And of course, has an enormous amount of money that goes to it, which means that there is de facto defunding of infrastructure, of education, of health services, of everything in US society, because the Pentagon is such a massive, monstrous, monomaniacal, to use Nosheen's word, actor, which people think is necessary to uphold American empire. So the situation is becoming similar in the subcontinent. So that's very scary to see. And I don't foresee war in any immediate sense, but just the threat of war and Cold War can itself be extremely suffocating. And what you have on the subcontinent for many decades is a Cold War, build up of preposterous military strength just to show off to the other side. This is what the Cold War on a global level was about. In the Middle East, something similar is happening. And so that in itself just stifles thought, just makes people, intellectuals, media, very stupid. It's amazing to see how Modi's hegemony is being consolidated more and more through the media landscape. I mean, stupidity is maybe a strong word, but it's really amazing to see Indian democracy. I don't follow it enough. I can't follow it enough. I don't work so much on India, to be honest here. But it's clear that what I pick up is that the nationalism is becoming very, very stifling. And thankfully, there is still civil society. Thankfully, there is still a farmers movement that Nosheen mentioned. There's a lot of activists. But when it comes to rich people and middle-class people, academia is different, but they are under threat. But the media landscape, apparently, the main newspapers are, and the judiciary, there's just a lot, there's just a sliding towards authoritarianism. And so I'm not sure what the question means with the disaster and biopolitics, but yeah, obviously any war is a sort of, if you read Foucault on biopolitics, war is always the threat that makes biopolitics possible. So he says that politics is war continued by other means. War is not like an exception for when the politics doesn't work anymore, but the threat of war, being able to invade, being able to kill, being able to put militarized borders, that is the bedrock of the nation state. There's no nation state which hasn't been born in war. Sometimes, it's a war of independence, and so then, for us on the left, it's a good thing. In the global south, usually, but very often it's been a bad thing. And the US experience was also a war of independence, the Revolutionary War, but it went hand in hand with slavery and genocide.
Thank you for that. Nosheen, do you want to answer the other part of that question? And my apologies, I read GB and automatically thought Great Britain.
No.
Obviously, it's you'll get Baltistan.
That's totally fine. I am not the best person to speak about inclusive social climates and disability rights in Gilgit-Baltistan. So sorry about that. That's my answer to that question.
Okay, thanks. There's quite a long question from Haider Ali here. I'll try to summarize. So Haider is asking about capitalism's ascension into space, and references Gil Scott Heron's Whitey Goes to the Moon, and asks, instead of just speaking of decolonial theory, we must now take social action for decolonial theory. And I believe that culture is recreated in struggle, as Fanon says, instead of curated by a decolonized academia. And then Haider goes on to ask about what a decolonial movement would look like within academia. Decolonial movement is crucial, and the ecological movement is, but it's stuck in academia. Where are the organizations of these movements among the oppressed classes and oppressed nations, raising consciousness, if not doing social action? Apologies to Haider for shortening your comment, but I wonder, Nosheen, whether you have a response to that.
I think a lot of it was actually answered through the presentation. I would say that is an attempt. We are constantly living such attempts. Those of us who are so-called women of color, terms that I don't like, because you're never the norm. You're always, let's say you're the other scholar, the diversity scholar. But there will be ways in which the racialized and patriarchal logics of academia is what capitalist modernity is, in my experience. I experience academia as a capitalist institution. So the fight within and the fight on the ground is the same. I see just different norms of patriarchy when I'm doing field work in Sindh than what I experience in academic peer reviews dominated by white, and apologies, often male South Asian reviewers. So colonized logics, the colonial situation, Arun, I want to thank you for raising very provocative questions about the colonial situation, about talking about the annihilation of buffaloes. I mean, when I think of these, I really think of the present. The colonial situation is so clear in the way land grabbing is happening in Kashmir. 10,000 trees were chopped off in one day in Indian occupied Kashmir. Pastoral homes are being burned as we speak. Whole regimes of ecological zones are being upturned. with a combination of militarism, capitalism, and nationalism, right? Which are at the same time patriarchal and racial as well, because there is global capital feeding these occupations. So to your question, Heather, about Fanon, I mean, yes, absolutely. We're all struggling in theory, in thought, in praxis. Um, and I think we've not done the work. I mean, he warns us, right? Do not play catch up with Europe. And all my academic life, if I didn't do that, I wouldn't survive. That's the truth. The narratives that I have to speak, and I mean, why can I not reference people on the field? Why do I have to reference certain books, which is a privilege? You are writing in English. That authorship, the whole model of I mean, this is the master's tools with the, that kind of a question as well. How are we going to dismantle and decolonize the university? I mean, that's a very urgent question for me. And Karti Dharti is an anti-academic move. It is an anti-colonial move where I'm like, enough of writing. How do I create a space where I decolonize myself and this particular piece of land for it to be a safe space, a free space? A space that teaches me far more than my sort of grand designs of manipulating the land and planning. I mean, you really learn organically in a way that I cannot express in journal articles, and I haven't. Um, so I don't know how to answer your question beyond that.
But at the same time, I will also say that theory is also important, of course, and so it's what we can do in academia. We are privileged, but we should use that time and that space and the fact that we have 3 months. I mean, in the US, 3 months in the summer. I'm going to have now 1 month. Now next week is my last class. These are material privileges, and we should use that time to do what we do best. And some of us, like, I'm much of a theory head, like I'm not much of a field worker, so
am I, by the way. I didn't want to make
right.
it, but that theory is a very Western racist theory too. That's what I mean. Who
But
counts as
sometimes
a
I feel
knowledge producer, you know?
work anymore. I feel bad because I'm like, oh, I don't have a particular set of.
No. I didn't mean to suggest that, but I meant decolonizing the work of theory.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
and whose knowledge counts as theory? The indigenous frameworks that I talk about are intimately theoretical.
Yeah.
They are deep visions of life. The poetry is praxis. The poetry is not Western English poetry of an individual publishing books. These are communal processes
And
of
many of them oral traditions as well, which are
right. So I mean, I love theory. Hello, I'm a product,
yes.
and this is where your gifts of academia to you in critical theory. I mean, you want to use it to then dismantle the whole system, right? So that's where you are.
Against the patriarchal aspects of it, and the white aspects and the bourgeois aspects. We can use the master's tools to to dismantle the
and freeing yourself from it, which is very hard. And rediscovering what you've lost. I mean, that loss, that mourning is a personal mourning too. It's that ecological loss is the loss of frameworks that my grandmother knew that I do not have access to anymore.
Because it was erased by this whole system in which we are also complicit in one way, but we're also trying to envisage a different way of things.
I hate to interrupt the discussion as well, because we could certainly continue this conversation for much longer, but I want to give the final question to Barkat Ali, who I believe is Nosheen's co-author and former student, and to ask you both about the role of students, because I think this ties into the conversation that you're having about the role of academia. So Barkat asks, do your students relate to what you teach there the way we used to relate to it here? So the question is for Nosheen, but I'd like to also ask Arun to weigh in about the role of students in critiquing colonial knowledges and in bringing in decolonial praxis.
Barkat, as you know, I learned far more from my students in environmental education than I had to teach them, precisely because their indigenous knowledge is way stronger, is way more grounded. I offered the theory uh, that encouraged them to express their voices. Um, I think students everywhere are pushing for the change as well. And I'm a big believer in collaborative knowledge production, which is another thing that in social sciences is less common. Arun, I don't know what your experience has been, but with the Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, which is a group of amazing decolonial feminists, I have learned so much. It's solidarity work on Kashmir, it is theoretical work on post colonial colonialism in South Asia, it is our praxis, it is our feminism, it is our friendship. Um, and that's the kind of model of knowledge making that I find my grounding in. Um, yeah, Arun.
Mhm. Yes, it reminds me of Rishi Nagar's work, a colleague of mine here at U of M. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she also does a lot of collaborative work in India, also from a collaborative feminist perspective. Yes, I mean, I don't do collaborations as such with undergraduate students, with graduate students sometimes. They are overwhelmingly white. So it would be great to have more um, non-whites. There's no word black and brown and immigrants and uh, students from non-traditional backgrounds in geography, but it tends to be a very wide discipline. Partly because there's no geography, there's very little geography in a lot of high schools. And so a lot of students don't know what geography is in the US when they come to choose their majors. And which is weird, of course, because geography should be about the world and it should be about disparities, it should be about pollution, environmental justice, climate change, etc. So yeah, I think it's crucial to see teaching as an extension of our politics and our activism. There's a number of people in geography who have activist scholarship, and so who do work on the ground, for example, on prison reform or on environmental justice issues or on sexual violence or on farming. And so that is an exciting field. I think that's really important when it comes to figuring out new imaginations which can actually stick and convince more and more people that a different way of doing things is just essential, because otherwise 2050 is not going to look very great.
Thank you both for your comments, and thank you to everyone for contributing questions. Apologies to those whose questions we wasn't able to get to. This has been a fantastic, stimulating, disturbing at times, but certainly compelling discussion. And I look forward to continuing to read your work and continuing to engage with these questions. Before we close, I just want to turn it over to Saskia to introduce the next panel, which will be in January.
Hi, thank you so much, Megan, and for all the contributions today. It's been a really brilliant event. Yeah, in January, on the 14th of January at 12 p.m. UK time and 8 p.m. Hong Kong time, we'll be having our first webinar of 2021 on Hong Kong, decolonization and the struggle for democracy. Our panelists will be Dr. Nicola Benson from Goldsmiths College London and Professor Lai Peng from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And they're going to be talking about the relationship between the civil unrest that's been going on in Hong Kong for the past 2 years and the status of Hong Kong as the UK's last colony, so that in inverted commas, and its relationship with China, which currently holds Hong Kong's sovereignty. So yeah, please do come along. The event will be live hopefully in the next couple of weeks, but certainly in January. So please do sign up. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, and have a lovely afternoon, rest of day, wherever you happen to be. And hope to see you all at the next seminar next month. Thanks, bye.